The phone call came at 4:47 in the morning. Solomon Vance was already awake. He was always already awake. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his bedroom on the third floor of his Crestfield estate, a glass of water in his hand, watching the fountain below throw silver arcs into the dark. The fountain never stopped. He had designed it that way. He had told the architect, "I want something that never rests." And the man had nodded like it was a poetic preference rather than a confession. The call was from his head of security. One of the exterior cameras had tripped. A fox, it turned out. Nothing more. Solomon said, "Fine," and ended the call and stood there for another 20 minutes in the dark alone. That was the word that kept finding him lately. Alone. Not in the self-pitying way people used it at dinner parties when they wanted sympathy. In a precise, clinical way. The way a doctor might say it. "You are, Mr. Vance, profoundly alone." And the numbers confirm it. He was 52 years old. His name was on 4 buildings in Crestfield's financial district and 7 more across the country. His portfolio had crossed 9 figures 2 years ago and kept climbing. He had been on the cover of Capital and Crest magazine 3 times. The last cover line read, "The man who turns ruins into gold." He had read it standing in a hotel corridor and felt absolutely nothing. What he felt now, most mornings, was something closer to a hollowness behind the ribs. A specific quiet that followed him from room to room in a house with 7 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms and a private cinema he had not entered in 4 months. He had grown up in Ashton. Most people from Ashton spent their lives trying not to mention it. It was the kind of town that collected people who had been forgotten by larger places. His mother cleaned offices. His father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. Solomon shared a bedroom with his 2 younger brothers until he was 16, and they kept a jar of coins on the windowsill for the electricity meter, and there were winters when the jar ran short. He studied like his life depended on it because he understood, clearly and early, that it did. He read every book the school library had on business and economics. He read them twice. He left Ashton at 18 with a partial scholarship in a duffel bag and a specific, burning hunger that he would later describe in interviews as ambition, though the more accurate word was fear. He bought his first rundown terraced house at 26, renovated it himself on weekends with tools borrowed from a neighbor, and sold it 4 months later for a profit that made his hands shake. Then he did it again, and again. 20 years later, the boy from Ashton who had counted coins in a jar had a fountain that ran 24 hours a day and could not sleep and did not know why. That was not true. He knew exactly why. Her name was Diane. They were young together, 23 and 24, and she was the first person he had loved with the reckless openness that you can only manage before the world has taught you better. She came from the same kind of nothing he did. He thought that meant something. He worked 2 jobs and helped her with rent and believed in the version of the future they talked about late at night in her small kitchen. When a man with a car and a salary and a quiet confidence came along, she left. She did not explain it badly. She just said, "I need someone who's already there, Sol. You're still becoming." He did not argue. He stood in her doorway and nodded and walked home, and something closed inside him like a window being latched shut from the inside. Then there was Petra. She came along during the years when the business was growing fast, and he was learning to trust again, slowly, the way you learn to put weight on a leg after a fracture. Petra was brilliant, organized, funny in a dry way that disarmed him. She handled his accounts for 2 years. When he finally had an auditor review the books, the number missing was £380,000. Petra was unreachable by the time he found out. He did not press charges. He just absorbed it and added another layer to the wall. Camille came last. She arrived in the good years, and she stayed through them, warm and easy, and he began to believe, foolishly, he thought now, that maybe the wall could come down. Then the market turned and 2 of his major projects hit delays, and for 7 months, everything was tight and stressful. He came home one evening to find her bags in the hallway and a note on the kitchen counter that said she needed more stability than he could offer right now. He had stood in the kitchen holding that note for a long time. Then he put it in the bin, ordered food he did not eat, and went back to work. That had been 4 years ago. Since then, there had been 3 women. Not in a careless way. In a careful, eyes-open way that was somehow worse. Vivian was 46. She moved through the world as though she had been born into it at the level she currently occupied. She wore things that cost as much as a small car and said almost nothing that wasn't precisely calibrated. She had been in Solomon's orbit for 2 years now, arriving at his events, laughing at the right moments, touching his arm in a way that suggested ownership without demanding it. She was patient in the specific way that very strategic people are patient. She was waiting for something, and Solomon suspected he knew what it was. Renata was 39. She had spent a decade in investment banking before moving into private consulting, and she viewed most situations, including personal ones, through the lens of risk and return. She was not unkind. She was precise. She had said to him once, over dinner, "You and I make sense, Solomon. The synergies are obvious." He had looked at her across the table and thought, "That is perhaps the loneliest sentence I have ever heard spoken in a romantic context." Zola was 30. She was genuinely joyful, which was rarer than people understood. She loved good food and travel and dancing badly in hotel rooms, and she never pretended otherwise. She was upfront about enjoying the life Solomon's money made possible, which he found, oddly, more honest than the other two. She did not love him. She liked him. There was a difference, and she was decent enough not to perform a former. None of them saw him. That was the thing. They saw the estate and the portfolio and the name on the buildings. They saw what he could provide, or what they could become adjacent to him. Not one of them had ever noticed that he skipped meals when he was anxious, or that he went quiet in a particular way when he was overwhelmed, or that he had not laughed, really laughed, the unguarded kind, in longer than he could remember. One person had noticed, but she was the maid, and that was not how these things were supposed to work. Miriam had been cleaning his house for almost 3 years. She was 27, quiet in the way that competent people often are, entering through the side door every morning at 7:30, moving through the rooms like someone who understood that her job was to make things better without being observed doing it. She was from Ravenswood, the neighborhood on the east side of Crestfield that the property brochures never mentioned. She had grown up with her grandmother, Nana Ruth, after losing her parents in a road accident when she was 9. She had a younger brother named Daniel. He died at 15 from a respiratory illness that the doctor said was treatable. It was treatable. The treatment simply cost more than their family had, and the waiting list for assisted funding was long, and Daniel ran out of time before the list moved. Miriam had sat beside his hospital bed and held his hand and watched him breathe in shorter and shorter intervals, and she had thought, with a fury that surprised her with its size, this did not have to happen. This was not nature. This was arithmetic. She carried that with her every day. Not visibly. She was not someone who wore her grief on her face for others to see. But it lived in her, and it shaped her, and it was why she sent half her wages to the Ravenswood Community Clinic every month, even when it left her short, and why she had not bought herself a new coat in 2 winters. She had noticed Solomon's pain because she recognized loneliness the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking. She saw it in the way he sat at the far end of the long dining table every morning with his coffee and his newspaper and did not read the newspaper. She saw it in the way he thanked her quietly whenever she left a fresh glass of water on his desk without being asked. She saw it in the way his voice was different at 7 in the morning compared to 8, smaller, somehow, more honest. She never said any of this. He was her employer. There were rules to this, structures, and she respected them. She did her work and went home and did not presume. Until the morning, he asked all 4 of them to come to the sitting room. It was a Thursday. Solomon was dressed, as always, as though the day had an agenda, dark trousers and a gray shirt, and the kind of calm that Miriam had come to understand was not peace but control. Vivian arrived first, in a cream coat that probably cost more than Miriam earned in 3 months. Renata came in checking her phone. Zola bounded in slightly breathless, grinning, saying sorry, the traffic on the West Bridge is a nightmare. And Miriam came last, because she had been finishing the kitchen and had to wash her hands first, and she stood slightly apart from the other 3, unsure where to position herself in a room like this, in a moment like this. Solomon placed 4 cards on the glass coffee table. They were matte black, heavy-looking, The kind of cards that did not have numbers printed on them because the people they were issued to did not need to be reminded of their account details. "One each," he said. "No limit. 24 hours. I want you to spend it however you choose. The only thing I ask is that you're honest about what you want. That's all." Vivian picked hers up with a small, satisfied smile, as though she had been expecting this. Renata turned hers over in her hand and was already calculating. Zola let out a short, delighted laugh and said, "Solomon, you cannot be serious right now." Miriam did not pick hers up. "I'm not sure this is for me," she said. Solomon looked at her directly. He did it rarely, and when he did it, it had a quality of attention that was different from how most people looked at you. "Why not?" "Because I'm your housekeeper," she said. It feels like it belongs to a different conversation." "Then think of it as a different conversation," he said. "For 24 hours, you're not my housekeeper. You're just Miriam. Can you manage that?" She looked at the card. She thought about Daniel. She picked it up. The card was heavier than it looked. On the bus home that evening, she always took the bus. She liked the thinking time. Miriam held the card in both hands and looked out the window at Crestfield sliding past. The good parts first. The glass-fronted restaurants, the boutiques with one expensive thing in the window, the hotels with doormen. Then the bus crossed the Halford Road Bridge, and the city changed. Smaller shops, laundrettes, chicken places, a shuttered GP surgery with a notice taped to the door. And then Ravenswood, where she had grown up, where Nana Ruth still lived in the same flat on the 4th floor, and where Daniel had died in a hospital that was 17 minutes away, but might as well have been on the moon. She thought about what the other women would do with a card like this. Vivian would spend it on herself, beautifully and without apology. She would walk out of the experience looking more like Vivian than she had before. There was something almost admirable in the purity of it. Renata would make it work. She would find a way to turn 24 hours of spending into a long-term asset. She probably had a list already. Zola would have the time of her life. She would call her best friend, and they would fly somewhere warm and laugh until they couldn't, and she would come back with sunburn and no regrets. Miriam found she genuinely couldn't be annoyed at that. And then there was Miriam, who was sitting on a bus in Ravenswood, holding a card with no limit, and thinking about a 15-year-old boy who loved football and died because the right number wasn't in the right account. She knew what she was going to do. She had known before the bus reached the bridge. She was going to give it away. She started at 7 the next morning at the Ravenswood Community Clinic on Pelham Street. She had been there before. She knew the layout. She knew the smell of the waiting room and the sound of the chairs scraping on the linoleum and the way the receptionist, a woman named Gloria, looked permanently exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She asked to speak with the director. A man named Dr. Osei came out from the back, removing his glasses and polishing them in that way people do when they're preparing to be patient with someone who might be wasting their time. He was a careful man. He had learned to be. "I want to help," Miriam said. "Specifically, tell me what you need most." He looked at her for a moment. "That's a broad question. Then give me a broad answer and we'll narrow it down." Dr. Osei sat down across from her, and for the next 40 minutes he talked. He talked about the 12 children currently mid-treatment who could not continue because their families had hit the cap on what they could pay. He talked about the nebulizer that had been broken for 2 months and the waiting list to get it serviced on the NHS budget. He talked about the medications they rationed because they could not afford a full supply. He talked about the leaking ceiling in the children's ward that the landlord kept promising to fix. He talked about it all in a measured, professional voice, and Miriam listened to every word. And when he finished, she said, "Okay, let's start with the children." She paid for 3 months of continued treatment for all 12 children on the spot, the clinic manager processing the card transaction with slightly shaking hands. She replaced the nebulizer. She funded a full medication supply restocked to capacity. She paid to have the ceiling repaired by a contractor she called from a number on the wall, who could come that afternoon for an emergency rate she didn't blink at. Dr. Osei stood in the middle of the newly funded clinic and said, very quietly, "Who are you?" "Nobody," Miriam said. "I'm nobody. Put the money to work, please." She left and walked 4 streets east to Halford Primary School, where she knew from Nana Ruth that 23 children had been sent home in the past month because of unpaid fees. She walked into the school office and introduced herself to the bursar and said she wanted to clear every outstanding balance. Full stop. The bursar stared at her. All of them. All of them. And I want to fund the lunch program for a full term. And I want to see the computer room. The computer room had 8 computers. 3 worked. She paid for 5 new ones and a printer and a technician to come and set it all up before the end of the week. She bought new textbooks for every year group that had flagged a shortage. She walked back through the school as she was leaving, and a little girl in a yellow cardigan was sitting in the corridor with her feet swinging, and Miriam looked at her and thought, Daniel sat just like that. He always sat just like that. She did not cry until she was back outside on the pavement, and then only briefly, and then she kept moving. The women's shelter on Brixton Lane was her last stop. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon and spoke with the coordinator, a woman named Adora, who had the particular composure of someone who had seen everything and was still showing up every day. Miriam asked what the shelter needed. Adora gave her a list that had been sitting on her desk for 3 months because the funding for it kept not materializing. Miriam funded the whole list. Food supplies for 6 months. Hygiene products. Emergency housing deposits for 4 families who had been approved for transitional housing, but were stuck because they couldn't cover the deposit. A new washing machine. A laptop so the residents could apply for jobs and benefits without having to use their phones. There will be people who try to thank you, Adora said. Please don't let them, Miriam said. I mean that kindly. Her final stop was a small trophy and engraving shop on Cavell Road that she had passed 100 times without ever going in. She went in and spoke to the man behind the counter for a few minutes, and he wrote something down, and she approved it, and she paid for a small brass plaque to be made and couriered to the Ravenswood Community Clinic within 48 hours. The inscription read, "For those we couldn't save in time, and those we still can." She did not put a name on it. She took the bus home and heated soup and called Nana Ruth and said she was fine. She was just tired. Everything was all right. She went to bed early. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about Daniel, thinking about the 12 children who would now finish their treatment, thinking about the little girl in the yellow cardigan. She felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite peace, but was adjacent to it. She felt that she had done the thing she was supposed to do with a day like that. She slept. Solomon received the statements the following morning. He sat at his desk with his coffee and opened the reports from the car provider, all 4 of them, and he read them in order. Vivian, $220,000, give or take. Jewelry, a pair of antique chairs from a Crestfield dealer. 3 outfits from a designer house in the capital. A spa weekend booked for the following month. He read through it and felt nothing except confirmation of what he already knew. Renata, $290,000. A deposit on a riverside investment property in the East Quarter. Stock purchases via her broker. A weekend at a members club in the countryside. Smart. Efficient. Entirely self-directed. He was not surprised. Zola, $160,000. Flights to Porto Sereno. Booked within an hour of receiving the card. For her and her best friend. Hotels. Dinners. Boutiques. At one point, an expensive pair of boots purchased for a woman named Clara who, according to the geotag data, was standing right next to her at the time. He found himself smiling at that. Zola was exactly Zola. He respected it. Then he opened Miriam's statement. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. The Ravenswood Community Clinic. 12 children's treatments. Medication restocked. Nebulizer replaced. Ceiling repaired. Halford Primary School. 23 fee balances cleared. Lunch program funded. Computer room rebuilt. New textbooks. Brixton Lane Women's Shelter. 6 months of supplies for housing deposits, equipment. A brass plaque from an engraver on Cavell Road. The total was less than any of the other 3 women, by a significant amount. And yet Solomon sat very still at his desk for a long time looking at it. The plaque. He kept coming back to the plaque. He called the clinic directly and asked about it. Dr. Osei described it to him. Brass. Small. Modest. 1 line. For those we couldn't save in time, and those we still can. Solomon Vance, who had not cried since Camille's note on the kitchen counter, and had not cried easily before that, put his phone face down on his desk, and pressed both hands flat on the wood, and breathed slowly and felt something give way inside him that he'd been holding in place by force for a very long time. He sat like that for 11 minutes. He knew because he looked at the clock when he was done. Then he stood up, straightened his shirt, and went to find Miriam. She was in the kitchen. Of course she was in the kitchen. She was wiping down the counters, her back to him, moving with the efficient, unhurried rhythm he had watched for 3 years without ever really seeing. She heard him come in and turn around and looked at him, and she could tell immediately from his face that he had read the statement. Her eyes were slightly red. So were his. Neither of them mentioned it. "Sit down," he said. It came out softer than he intended. "Please." She sat at the kitchen island. He sat across from her, and for a moment he just looked at her properly, in a way he should have done long ago. "Why?" he said. She did not pretend not to understand the question. "Because I've been where those people are," she said. "Not exactly, but close enough. Tell me." She looked at the counter for a moment. Then she looked up at him and told him about Daniel. She told it plainly, without performance, the way you tell a true thing that you have carried so long it has lost its rawness and become simply the shape of you. Her brother, the illness, the list, the arithmetic, holding his hand. Solomon listened without speaking. He did not offer consolation or reach for the right words. He just listened, which was, Miriam thought, exactly the right thing to do. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "I gave 4 people unlimited resources," Solomon said finally. "And you used yours to try to make sure no one else loses a brother the way you lost yours." "The money was already there," Miriam said. "It just needed pointing in the right direction. That's not how most people think about it." "I know." Another silence. Solomon turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter. "You notice that I'm lonely," he said. "I think you've noticed for a while." "How?" Miriam considered the question carefully. "Because you thank me when I put water on your desk," she said. "People who have someone to talk to don't need to save up gratitude for small things. It means the small things are the only things." Solomon looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not pain exactly. Something more like relief. Like a thing being named that has been nameless a long time. "I've been told I'm hard to know," he said. "You're not hard to know," she said. "You're just careful. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "You shouldn't have to be this perceptive about your employer's emotional state." "No," she agreed. "But here we are." The ghost of something like a smile crossed his face. The real kind. Unguarded. Miriam had never seen it before, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought, that is who he actually is under all of it. He called the meeting the following morning. All 4 women in the sitting room again. The same room, the same chairs, daylight this time instead of the evening warmth. Vivian sat very straight. Renata had brought a notepad. Zola had brought coffee in a travel cup, and she offered some to Miriam, who was standing slightly to the side again, and Miriam said no thank you, and Zola shrugged and said, "Your loss, it's really good." Solomon stood. He did not have notes. He had thought about what he wanted to say since the night before, and he knew the shape of it. "I gave each of you a card," he said, "because I wanted to understand something. I've spent my life being careful about trust because I've paid for being careless with it. I've been watching for a long time, waiting for someone to surprise me." He paused. "Yesterday I was surprised." He looked at Vivian. "You spent beautifully," he said. "Everything you chose will make you look exactly as you want to look. That's not a criticism, but it told me what I needed to know." Vivian held his gaze. She did not flinch. She was too composed for that, but something behind her eyes acknowledged it. He looked at Renata. "You made smart choices. Every purchase was defensible. You spent the day building a stronger version of your own future. I would expect nothing less from you." He said it without edge. He meant it. He looked at Zola. "You went to Porto Sereno." He said it, and Zola immediately started to speak, and he held up a hand, gently. "You brought your friend. You bought her shoes when she saw a pair she loved. You had a real day." He paused. "I actually like yours best of the 3. Zola blinked. "Then why do I feel like there's a but coming?" "Because there is," he said. He turned to Miriam. "Miriam spent less than any of you. By a wide margin. She also paid for 12 sick children to finish their treatment. She cleared the fees of 23 kids who were going to be sent home from school. She funded 4 families who needed housing deposits. She put up a plaque at the clinic in memory of her brother, who died of a treatable illness at 15 because the money wasn't there. The room was quiet. She didn't spend a single pound on herself, Solomon said. Not one. Vivian was the first to speak. That's admirable, she said carefully. She meant it, Miriam thought. It was just that admirable was the most Vivian could get to. Renata said, it's a significant allocation of resources to high-impact community need. She caught herself. I mean, what you did was important, Miriam. Zola put down her coffee. She looked at Miriam directly, and her expression was open and unguarded in that way that was uniquely hers. I'm sorry about your brother, she said. I'm really sorry. Miriam nodded. Thank you. Vivian and Renata left with composure and without drama. They were both too intelligent to make a scene. Zola paused in the doorway and looked back at Miriam and said, he was lucky to have a sister like you. Then she left, and the sound of the main door closing was very clean in the quiet house. And then there were 2. Solomon and Miriam in the sitting room, the light coming in at an angle through the tall windows, and somewhere outside the fountain keeping its endless rhythm. I owe you an apology, Solomon said. Miriam looked up, surprised. For what? For 3 years of looking right through you. He said it without drama, as a plain fact. You've been in this house every day, and I treated you like furniture. Good, reliable, invisible furniture. That was wrong. It's a professional arrangement, Miriam said carefully. It was also careless on my part, he said. And I'm not careless. I pride myself on paying attention. I missed something important. She didn't answer. She looked at her hands. I want to do something, he said. Not because of yesterday, or not only because of yesterday, because it's overdue. 3 weeks later, he asked her to come to his study. She came in her work clothes because it was a Tuesday and she had been cleaning, and she sat across the desk from him wondering whether she was about to be let go with a generous severance, because that was the shape of the conversation in her imagination. She was already calculating what she would do, how long she could manage, whether the clinic would be all right. Solomon slid an envelope across the desk. Open it, he said. She did. Inside was a letter with several attachments. She read it slowly. Then she read it again. A bank account in her name. £2 million. A deed for a 3-bedroom house in the Thornfield Quarter, fully furnished, held in her name. For her and Nana Ruth. A personal trust, structured for her future security, managed by his legal team. And then the last page. She read it and looked up at him. The Daniel Fund, she said. Seated with $4 million, he said. Purpose, funding medical treatments for families who can't cover the cost. Focused on Ravenswood and the surrounding districts initially, with scope to expand. He paused. I want you to run it. Not as staff. As its director. You design the priorities. You decide who gets help. You build the thing. Miriam sat completely still. The letter was in her hands, and her hands were not entirely steady. Solomon, she said. Don't argue with me about whether you deserve it, he said. And there was the ghost of that smile again. I've read the argument you made with your actions last week, and it was more convincing than anything you'll say right now. She did not argue. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the letter and then up at the ceiling, briefly, the way people do when they're holding something that is too large for the inside of a room. Then she looked at him. He would have thought this was too much, she said. Daniel. She meant Daniel. Tell me about him, Solomon said simply. And she did. She told him about the way Daniel laughed, big and sudden, like it caught him off guard every time. She told him about how he was going to be a physiotherapist because he'd read that they helped athletes recover from injuries, and he thought that sounded like the best possible job. She told him about the afternoon she taught him to cook jollof rice on Nana Ruth's old stove, and he burned the first batch completely and was outraged about it for a week. She told him about the last few months, about how he kept saying, I'm okay. Miri stopped fussing right up until the point when he wasn't. Solomon listened. He asked a question here and there, not to fill the silence, but because he wanted to know, and Miriam, who had spent years carrying Daniel mostly alone, found that telling it to someone who was genuinely listening felt like setting down a weight she had forgotten was heavy. The Ravenswood Community Clinic was repainted in February. New equipment arrived in March. By April, it had doubled its capacity for pediatric patients, with 3 additional part-time doctors brought in under a contract funded by the Daniel Fund. The brass plaque went up on the wall of the children's ward, small and unflashy, and the nurses walked past it every day, and sometimes someone would stop and read it and stand there quietly for a moment. For those we couldn't save in time, and those we still can. Halford Primary School got a new computer room, fully operational, and a library refresh, and a reading program that Miriam designed herself and piloted on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the floor with 8 7-year-olds who were delighted to have an adult on the floor with them. Nana Ruth moved into the Thornfield house on a Saturday in late spring, and she stood in the kitchen with its yellow walls and its wide window overlooking the small garden, and she held Miriam's face in both hands and did not say anything for a long moment, because there was too much to say, and some things are too large for words. She settled for, "Daniel knows, child. Somewhere he knows." Miriam did not trust herself to answer. She just held her grandmother's hands. Solomon changed too, but slowly, the way real change happens. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. He started eating breakfast at the kitchen island instead of the long dining table. He started saying good morning and meaning it, and asking questions and listening to the answers. He spent 3 Saturdays in a row in Ravenswood, walking the streets he was now investing in, talking to the people who lived there. Not for optics, because Miriam had made him understand that the distance between his estate and that side of the bridge was not as natural as it had seemed. He was not suddenly fixed. He was not suddenly light and unguarded and free of the walls he had spent 30 years building. But there were windows in those walls now. Small ones. Enough for light. He and Miriam were careful with each other. There was something between them that was not nothing, but they were both too honest to rush it and too aware of the history and the asymmetry to be reckless. What they had, for now, was a genuine friendship of the kind that arrives unexpectedly in your 50s and your late 20s and surprises both parties with its solidity. They had breakfast conversations. They argued, occasionally, about the priorities of the fund. She told him when she thought he was wrong about something, and he listened, which was more than most people in his life had ever done, and he told her when he thought she was taking on too much, and she ignored him mostly, which was exactly right. One afternoon in May, Solomon was walking through the children's ward at the clinic. He came once a week now, quietly, without a retinue, and a small boy of about 6 stopped in the corridor and looked up at him and said, "Are you the man who helped fix this place?" Solomon crouched down to be at the boy's level. "No," he said. "That was someone else. I just helped her do it." The boy considered this. "Is she nice?" "She's the best person I know," Solomon said. The boy nodded, satisfied, and walked off. Solomon stood up and looked at the plaque on the wall. "For those we couldn't save in time, and those we still can." He thought about Ashton. He thought about the jar of coins on the windowsill. He thought about the boy he had been, hungry and frightened and furious about it, and how that boy had spent 30 years running from the fear without understanding that what he'd actually needed was someone to run toward. He had found her in the one place he hadn't thought to look. He stood there in the corridor of the Ravenswood Clinic for a few minutes while the sounds of a working, funded, breathing clinic moved around him. The footsteps and the voices and the children and the equipment that worked, and he felt for the first time in longer than he could name, something that was not loneliness. Something that was almost its opposite. Worth, he thought, not the kind that showed up on a portfolio statement. The other kind. The kind you had to earn from the inside out. He walked out into the afternoon, into the ordinary noise of Ravenswood, and his driver was waiting, and he told the driver to give him 20 minutes, and he walked down Pelham Street alone and thought about what came next. There was a lot that came next. That was the thing about starting late. There was so much ground to cover. But there was also, finally, a reason to cover it. He walked, and the city moved around him, and somewhere across town, in an office on the 4th floor of a building he owned, Miriam was in a meeting with 3 doctors and a school principal and a housing officer. And she was leaning forward over the table with that expression she got when she was about to solve something, and she was saying, "No, listen, I think we're overcomplicating this." And they were listening, and the Daniel Fund was doing what it was designed to do, and Daniel's name was on a plaque on a wall in a children's ward where 12 small people had finished their treatment and gone home. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story stayed with you, do something simple right now. Hit the like button, leave a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Every single story on this channel is designed to remind you what people are actually capable of when they choose to be. Don't miss them.